been knowing anyone, and I've been really embraced, and I'm very grateful. Also, you have an old school. There's no PowerPoint to be seen. I have 154 slides, but this is entirely my fault. I forgot to request in advance, so you will have to bear with me. My second book, getting ahead of myself. My second book, called Unraveled, focuses on a high level on 3 cases: Hobby Lobby, King against Burwell, and the Little Sisters of the Poor litigation. But it's much, much more than that. It's my demonstrative device. As the cover suggests, this is not just about legal battles, but also about political battles. As we've seen in the last few years, the ACA has become a political leviathan. Our former chapter member and current U.S. Senator, Ted Cruz, has proved that point amply. In fact, when I gave a talk here 3 years ago, I think I said something like, well, you know what? I think the battle of Obamacare is more or less winding down. How wrong I was. And with some wisdom, I'd like to discuss this new book, which is not yet for sale, but it will be next week. And if you like, I have these little cool book plates. I'll autograph you, and then you can buy a copy and slap it in. So this is a story I tell in 9 parts of how to understand where we are with the Affordable Care Act, commonly known as Obamacare. And to be frank, our story actually begins with Hillary Care. Yes, indeed. Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton attempted in 1993 to transform our healthcare system, the Health Securities Act, as it were. But Hillary and Bill made a very fatal mistake. They assumed that people would be okay with giving up what they already have. Now, this may surprise you because you won't hear this number in the media, but year after year, roughly 80% of people who have insurance say they are happy with their insurance. But herein lies a paradox, my friends. About 60% of Americans say, well, I like my insurance, but I want to make insurance better for everyone else. I want to improve the market. You can't do both. If we like what we have, we can't help others. But to help others, we have to give up what we have in the form of worse care, higher premiums, etc. This is what killed Hillary Care with a series of commercials known as the Harry and Louise commercials. Everyone remember these? Some of the younger millennials may not. I vaguely recall them. But these were a series of commercials. You had this ma and pa sitting at a table saying, wow, this new healthcare law, I like my doctors. I want to keep my doctors. And it worked. Hillary Care was killed in the span of about 1.5 years. The numbers supporting it dropped significantly. But this is, again, the same paradox that President Obama faced. How can I sell the American people on a healthcare reform without them worrying they're going to lose the plans they have? This was crystallized in a single promise that was repeated nearly 3 dozen times. Everyone know what it is? Repeat after me. If you like your plan, you can, yes, you can, exactly, you know what I'm talking about. This wasn't just a pernicious lie. This was a fundamental misrepresentation of how healthcare worked. The entire premise of the ACA was to, use the phrase, spread the wealth. It was to take insurance from people who have it and spread it to those who are sick or older or poorer. This is how the law worked. But this lie was told over and over again to assuage these concerns, to make people think, wow, there's no big deal. We'll be fine, right? We'll keep what we have. This cannot happen. And to make this lie even more pernicious, and I don't use that adjective lightly, as the president was making this promise, his administration was putting forward regulations that made it harder to keep grandfathered plans. So this wasn't some sort of errant lie, right? This was a deliberate effort by his administration to mislead. If you read the book, there are discussions by his advisor saying, well, you know, it's kind of complicated to say if you like your plan, you can keep your plan as long as your plan meets the qualifications of the law. Right? That's not a good marketing pitch. So rather than having truth in advertising, they went with this pitch. And without this, I don't think the law could have passed. But indeed, pass it did. As you recall, the ACA passed the Senate on December 24th, Christmas Eve of 2009, on a straight party line vote. 60 Democrats, not a single Republican supporting it. This is the first time in the 20th century that a law of this scale passed without any bipartisan buy-in. Give me any law, Social Security, American Disability, Civil Rights Act. They all have bipartisan buy-in, not the ACA. But then something funny happened the way to healthcare utopia. Senator Ted Kennedy had passed away, And his replacement was a Republican by the name of Scott Brown. If you remember Scott Brown, he was elected on this Tea Party surge in January of 2010. And just like that, the Senate lost their filibuster-proof majority. As a consequence, they can no longer actually amend the bill that they passed. See, the thing on Christmas Eve, that was a draft. That was not meant to be the final version of the bill. So now we're stuck, my friends. We are stuck with a draft. This is like version 1.0. This didn't have the red line, son. There was no conference. There was no amendment. It was basically pass this bill or whatever. And the expert said, well, we'll pass this bill now and we'll amend it later. Good luck with that. So you have a new piece out in National Review of this month's issue discussing the hubris of the ACA. That the central planners assumes, well, once we pass this thing, everyone will fall in line, right? Everyone will just love this Obamacare thing, and it's going to be like this awesome thing. Not quite. In fact, the opposition to the ACA has remained nearly 6 years later. The law has never peaked above a 50% popularity. So we have this law. It was a draft. It was never meant to be final, and it's basically transforming 20% of the American economy. And it passed without any Republican buy-in. So you wonder why, even to this day, every Republican says repeal, replace, repeal. They have nothing invested in this law. It was an arrogant decision to pass in this manner, and we are stuck with the fallout of that choice from the president and his administration. But in any event, moments after the law was passed and President Obama signed into law, lawsuits were filed by Florida, by Virginia, by a number of other parties, challenging, as you all recall, the law's individual mandate. The argument was, well, Congress cannot compel people to buy health insurance. Okay. Well, law professors back then said, of course Congress can regulate health insurance. It's a multi-billion-dollar market. How is that not interstate commerce? And as we all know, it went to the Supreme Court, and the subject of my first book, Unprecedented. The court, I still sigh. Every time I teach us, some former students here, every time I teach it, I get sad. The Chief Justice, in his infinite wisdom, said, well, we will uphold this law as a tax, even though it's an unconstitutional regulation of commerce, and the ACA survives its first brush with destiny. Sigh. But that was old, and I presented to you 3 years ago after the NFIB case. What happened next? Well, you'll recall there was a guy named Mitt Romney. He apparently ran for president, wouldn't even remember nowadays. But he ran the promise of repealing and replacing Obamacare. This was illusory. Why? Because in his own home state of Massachusetts, he implemented Obamacare, the exact same framework as the national law he and Jonathan Gruber created in Massachusetts. That went nowhere. At the debates, Barack Obama called Romney the godfather of Obamacare. And frankly, that was an accurate description. And here we are now in President Obama's second term, and that brings me to the gravamen of the book. The first theme that I'd like to discuss with you is what I call conscience and contraception. Now, I'm going to blow your minds. I'm going to blow your minds right now. If any of you read The Vol Conspiracy this week, you have a preview. I'm guest blogging there this week. True or false? Congress voted on a contraception mandate. False. The word contraception appears nowhere in the ACA. Blowing your minds, right? The only provision in the ACA that even relates to this current controversy is the word preventive care. Congress said for women, employers will provide, quote, preventive care. And as we all know, under the Chevron doctrine, if Congress passes an ambiguous word, and that's, what the hell's preventive care? The agency can decide what that term means. And that's precisely what happened. The agency said, well, Congress passes laws saying preventive care. We're going to make that mean the entire range of FDA-approved birth control, including the morning after pill and various other drugs. Now, what is odd about this? You would think that if Congress was passing a bill that requires all employers, even religious nonprofits, to pay for this, there would have been some debate, right? Silence. The Democrat sponsor of this bill, Senator Mikulski of Maryland, was deliberately silent. She refused any amendments about what this preventive care would be. Someone said, well, what about abortions? Oh, no, it will never cover abortions. Will you change the text? No, we will not change the text. This is a case where, for the Chevron skeptics in the room, you should be very angry. They left this term deliberately vague, knowing that the bureaucracy would interpret in this fashion and create the contraception mandate. Because had Congress actually thought about this, they would create a conscience clause. Did you know for the individual mandate, you can be exempted from that if you have a religious objection? They thought about that because they realized what a mandate to buy insurance means. Here, there was nothing. In fact, if you read my a brief in the Zubik case and also my forthcoming piece in the Harvard Law Review, I argue that the entire ACA contraceptive litigation is ultra vires. Forget religious freedom. They don't have the authority to do what they're doing at all. This is an admin law abomination. It's true. But an abomination we have in more ways than one. So the ACA was enacted, and then ultimately the bureaucracy said, we will interpret this to cover all religious employers. Initially, the only groups that were exempt from this mandate were houses of worship, but not all houses of worship. The regulation basically said, if you service people outside of your faith, you are not exempt. So imagine you have a church that operates a soup kitchen or a hypothermia shelter, and they don't check baptism certificates at the door, right? They let everyone in from the street. They are not religious enough for the first round of the Obama administration. They were not religious enough to be exempted. As you can imagine, this pissed people off, right? People got very angry at this. They said, okay, well, you can service people outside the faith, and we'll not quite exempt you, right? We'll do something different. We'll simply say, the insurance company will pay for this contraception, we'll just use your plan, right? And if you sign this form and tell us who your insurer is, we will work through you, okay? This was objected by a number of religious groups, both for-profit and non-profit. The first case that would come up would involve the Hobby Lobby Corporation, and this was a craft store. They have chains all over Houston, and they sell various picture frames, everything else. A funny story, by the way. So I sent a copy of my first book to all the justices, and about half of them wrote me letters back thanking me for the book. So I framed those letters at Hobby Lobby. So I got this letter from Justice Sotomayor in a Hobby Lobby frame. It's true. So the clerk at Hobby Lobby chuckled when I brought it in there. But in any event, so Hobby Lobby was the first group to bring suit, and they argued this violated their religious liberty as a corporation. Okay, but we'll come back to Hobby Lobby in a minute, because I want to take you guys chronologically. The next phase of the story is from the summer of 2013. You may remember this. During this summer, our former member and U.S. Senator, Ted Cruz, was on TV every 5 seconds. Remember these commercials, right? Call Congress to defund Obamacare. You remember these commercials, right? You couldn't avoid them. Call Congress to defund Obamacare. So at this point, the last-ditch effort was to defund Obamacare. Why? They didn't have enough votes to repeal it. Congress couldn't do it, right? They didn't have enough votes to replace it. So the idea was, let's defund the damn thing. How would this come together? A magical coincidence of scheduling. The budget, what's called the continuing resolution, ended September 30th of 2013. The Obamacare exchanges opened on October 1st. Look at that, right? Budgeting ended September 30th. Obamacare opens October 1st. So Ted Cruz and the others are like, yeah, we got this, right? Let's block the funding of the U.S. government to stop Obamacare. Now, with respect to my senator, it wouldn't work. Obamacare is funded by what's called a permanent appropriation. It cannot be defunded. Even if the entire U.S. government was shut down, Obamacare would live on its own. It's like, that'd be the undead part of the trilogy, right? You cannot kill this thing. You have to basically eliminate the law to get rid of the funding. But try they did. Senator Cruz and Senator Lee barnstormed the country until it came that our senator read his children a nursery rhyme from the Senate floor. Senator Cruz had a nearly 23-hour filibuster. And it wasn't actually a filibuster. I want to make this point clear. A vote was scheduled for 12 o'clock the next day. He had to stop speaking at that point. A filibuster, by definition, means you keep speaking until you can't speak anymore. So he was cut off by Harry Reid's scheduled vote. But that also means that Ted's filibuster did not shut down the government. Indeed, the government shut down a week later. People forget that sequencing. But Senator Cruz was on the floor, speaking out against Obamacare. He read Carolyn and Catherine, a nice, I think it was Green Eggs and Ham. And it was a very important moment for Obamacare. What did it accomplish? Not a lot. So perhaps it helped his campaign for a bit. But it didn't get what he achieved, right? So after Senator Cruz's speech, the House agreed and said, okay, we will also not vote for a budget. The clock struck 12 on September 30th. There was no more funding for the U.S. government. And we had the shutdowns. So if you remember the national parks, the World War II veteran memorials, the barricades were put up. These poor vets coming from out of town to see the memorial could not enter the sacred space. So what happened? Well, they took these barricades and dropped them on the White House lawn, as it were. This went on for about 2 weeks until the next looming crisis, which was the debt ceiling. Everyone remember this? In addition to the budget, there's also a limit of how much debt the United States can incur. And that's basically raised every couple months, so we keep spending indefinitely. The Republicans folded. They folded. I mean, they had no meaningful choice. So not only was Obamacare not defunded, the government was funded at a full level without sequestration. One of the key things Republicans got to cut spending was lost because of this entire mess. Obama basically said, I'm not negotiating with any of you guys. Screw you guys. Whatever you want, I don't care. I am not negotiating with you. And that's precisely what happened, and the Republicans caved. But as soon as the government opened up, attention focused on healthcare.gov. Now, did anyone in this room use healthcare.gov? You did. Okay, only one. Usually when I say this in a law school crowd, all the hands go up because they're all students. They need to buy their own insurance. They're not in their parents' plan anymore. But healthcare.gov was supposed to be like an Expedia or an Amazon or a Kayak experience where you have options with many plans and you can easily get insurance. It didn't work, and that is a gross understatement. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars on a website that was entirely non-operational. People couldn't log on, they couldn't buy plans, and this actually threatened the legitimacy of the entire website. The entire Obamacare was threatened because of this. And they had to make a choice, right? The choice is, do we scrap this and start from scratch, or do we somehow fix it? And thanks to a movement known as the tech surge. What is this tech surge? Well, you think of these nerds on Normandy, right, surging the beaches, right, coming on the barges. It was actually a little bit less dramatic. Like 5 guys from Google and Facebook came in and built the entire damn thing in about a month. So you have these 5 nerds from the Silicon Valley did what the entire federal bureaucracy couldn't do in like 3 years. They saved the president's administration. I don't put that point lightly. Yeah, they saved the administration. So by the end of Thanksgiving, give or take, the website worked well enough, and you could apply, and you could sign up. So that was the first major victory for the president, and he deserves credit for getting it back on track. But around the same time that the website was crashing and burning, people started getting letters in the mail. You know what letters I'm talking about? Anyone get one of those? Cancellation letter? Wow. Okay, so you're all gainfully employed, so you don't have to worry about this. But with good employers. The president's promise that you can keep your plan if you like it crumbled. In the fall of 2013, roughly 4 million Americans received a notice in the mail saying that their plans were canceled. Okay, why were their plans being canceled? Because they did not comply with the strict regulations of the ACA. The ACA said you have to have, this very sterling level of care and these high this and this high that. And if you had a cheap plan, which you actually liked, guess what? You could not keep it, no matter how much you liked it. And this put the president in something of a pinch. Why? He had promised millions of Americans they can keep their plans, and it turned out to be not true. In fact, PolitiFact called it the lie of the year. If you like your plan, you can keep your plan. So how did he fix this? Executive action. This is one of the first in a series of illegal actions he took. He told people, okay, you know what? This thing called the individual mandate, just kidding. If you don't want to have insurance because it's too expensive, I will not penalize you. And oh, by the way, insurance companies, if you guys want to keep selling these old plans that are not compliant, I'm not going to enforce the law against you either. This is a pattern of suspension, of not enforcing laws that are unpopular. And in addition to being illegal, it was actually counterproductive because millions of people who would have otherwise bought insurance and helped diversify these risk pools stayed out of the market. He sabotaged his own law. I have a piece in the Vol Conspiracy today about this. It's stunning how short-sighted and desperate this was, right? To prevent the immediate, shock of this, he basically sabotaged the law to this day. So there are still people who have plans that ought to be canceled in 2016 that are still on this grandfathering executive action. So, by hook or crook, one way or another, people were now able to sign up. And eventually, by I think it was April of 2014, they got the number to about 8 million people. And that number sounds awesome, right? 8 million new people had insurance. Well, a lot of them already had insurance they liked and had to get something new that was more expensive. But more pressingly, whenever you see these numbers, not all of them paid for it. Now, here is the biggest scam in Obamacare. People know that they can sign up, get treatment, cancel it, and they'll be perfectly fine. So of those 8 million people, about 7 million actually paid their premiums the entire year. There's actually there's studies on this that the people who sign up late, use coverage and cancel, use much more care. They are driving up the cost. But why are we surprised? People are rationally self-interested. If I can go and get expensive surgery and cancel my care immediately, never pay the bills, why wouldn't I do that? This is the perverse incentive of the ACA. And because the mandate is either not being enforced or not big enough to be effective, people are gaming the system, as to be expected. Okay. Let's shift back to religious liberty. And let's talk about Hobby Lobby and RFRA. As I'm sure you all know, there was a decision by our patron saint, Justice Scalia, that wasn't so saintly, which was called Employment Division against Smith. This involved peyote. And you had a Native American guy named Al Smith use peyote as part of a religious sacrament. He was fired from his job. He tried to apply for unemployment. The government said, we will not give you unemployment benefits because you are terminated for a use of a controlled substance. Went to the Supreme Court, and in a very unpopular decision from Justice Scalia, the court said, that's fine. So long as the law is applied generally to everyone, right? Everyone can, get this unemployment unless you break the law. There's nothing targeting Native Americans. This decision did not go over well with Congress. About a year or two later, they passed RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It's remarkable that this was passed by President Clinton with almost a unanimous Congress. And now here we are, 20 years later, and people are trying to repeal RFRA, as they call them hate laws and blanket discrimination, whatever, right? But that's where we were 2 decades ago. Why is this relevant? Because RFRA says if the government wants to substantially burden your religion, they have to do so very narrowly and have a good reason for doing it. This gave rise to Hobby Lobby's a case. Okay? Hobby Lobby, as I'm sure you all know, is not a person. It is a corporation. And the government argued, wait a minute, because you're a corporation, you have no rights, right? You're not a person. So this argument always troubled me. I'm sure you are all members of a church or a synagogue. Believe it or not, your church is a corporation. It's incorporated in the laws of Texas. And by its bylaws, it exercises faith as a collective. This was such a simple argument to that this is the Anti-Citizens United, propaganda, right? It's not controversial. In fact, 1 USC 1, Section 1 of the U.S. Code, called the Definition Act, defines a person to include a corporation. So this was the easy part of the case. I mean, and only actually Justice, ironically, Sotomayor and Ginsburg said corporations can never exercise religious freedom. So if you're a kosher halal butcher, and the state passes a law saying you can no longer slaughter animals in the requisite fashion, you can't sue. Too bad. You can't sue. In fact, Justice Alito asked this question, and the government said, well, maybe the customers of the butcher shop can sue. But it's not a regulation on them. It's a regulation on the butcher shop. So this part of the case I don't think was particularly controversial. The other controversial part, though, was, is paying for someone else's birth control a substantial burden on your faith? And the government said, well, no, they're not using the contraceptive. No one's making the Green family, use the morning after pill. They're simply paying for someone else to do it. This argument did not go over well either. Directly subsidizing something you deem sinful, and I think this is not too controversial, is making you complicit in that form of sin. The case, though, split because, as always, Justice Kennedy decided to, it was a little Justice Kennedy dance. It's a funny thing. So in this article I have in the Harvard Law Review, I have this thing where I say, Justice Kennedy questioned. And the editor's like, he didn't actually ask a question. I'm like, he never does. There's never a question. It's a statement, but I leave it in there for that purpose. Justice Kennedy concurred and said, well, we have to be careful about the third-party harms because these women at Hobby Lobby aren't able to get access to certain forms of emergency contraception, and so we have to be careful. But if there's some way of getting them this care, otherwise, it's fine, right? They can go on the Obamacare exchanges. They can have some other method of providing it. So the court upheld it, but there was a Queasy-Kennedy concurrence. That's alliteration. That was the first case, and that was the Hobby Lobby decision. The next case is nowhere nearly as interesting, and in fact rather pedantic. It's a case called King against Burwell. The ACA, as originally designed, had 2 components. There was a House bill and there was a Senate bill. Okay? The House bill imagined that there would be a single national healthcare exchange for people to buy insurance. Right? The House did not trust, states like Texas to build their own exchanges. The Senate bill said, no, we should have states build the exchange in the first instance, and if the state doesn't do it, like Texas, they can fall back on a federal exchange. This is what's known as cooperative federalism, right? You can't make a state build an exchange, but if the state does so poorly, you can operate a federal exchange in its place and preempt that. Okay, so what happened? There was the House bill with one exchange and the Senate bill with many exchanges. Scott Brown happened. As a result of that, we are now stuck with the Senate bill, which allows states to make their own exchanges. But herein lies the problem. A provision of the ACA, known as Section 36B, says, and I will quote, subsidies are available in an exchange, quote, established by the state. Okay. So if one were to read that, quickly, you would say, well, an exchange established by the state is an exchange established by the state. And that would seem to be a convenient usage of the English language, but Obamacare does not rely on such simplicity. As it turned out, most states said this exchange thing is a waste of money. We're not going to do this. Only 14 states built their exchanges, and to update that number, within the next 2 years, I think most of them will fold. There's a lot of federal money slushing into them to keep them afloat. That money ends after next year. So these exchanges will implode. So now you have 36 states where people are logging on to healthcare.gov, the magical website, and they're getting these subsidies through this federal marketplace. 2 lawsuits were challenged, asserting that these payments were illegal. There was the Halbig case in D.C., and then there was the King case in Virginia. So how could it be that a statute that says subsidies are available for an exchange established by the state allows subsidies in a federal exchange? How can this be? So I'll try to summarize without the benefit of the text, which I can't show you, as simply as possible. The government says what the Secretary of HHS is establishing is a state exchange. Let's say this again. The Secretary of HHS is actually creating a state exchange. This such exchange refers to a state exchange, and who's making it? The federal government. I hear people chuckling, but this reasoning prevailed on, once again, the Chief Justice. And in a decision of King against Burwell, by a 6-3 vote this time, the court upheld the payment of these subsidies. And the chief said, the plain meaning of the text, right, there's strength there, right? It's a valid argument. But there's other stuff too. And in the final page of the opinion, which breaks my heart every time I read it, the Chief Justice says, and this is almost a paraphrasing quote, the purpose of the ACA was to improve health insurance, not to destroy it. So we will read the ACA in that fashion. The singular purpose of the ACA, there's only one purpose, right? Was to improve health insurance, not to destroy it. And we will read the ACA in that fashion. We can get into arguments about statutory interpretation till maybe the projections will work at that point. But this is not how statutory interpretation works. The ACA was a complicated morass of thousands of interest groups competing, and they reached a compromise for having a balance of state and federal exchanges. It was not at all implausible for the Fed to say, we will withhold money from you if you don't do something. This was actually a fairly common routine under the Clean Air Act and otherwise. If states don't do stuff, they lose money. Right? This is how cooperative federalism works. It only became a problem because the federal government started paying out subsidies for 36 states. And then people relied on it. And there's like, well, if you take this money back, these people will lose their dialysis. This was, a perversion, I think, of statutory interpretation. But this was the court's decision. Justice Scalia, in what will be his last dissent read from the bench, is a doozy. And he said, this represents the court's new approach, which is basically paraphrasing, the ACA must be saved. All the normal rules of interpretation go out the window because this law must be saved. And he said we should start calling the law, ready? SCOTUS care, right? The first time the word SCOTUS was used in a SCOTUS opinion. And Scalia was very upset, as he ought to be. But this decision basically signaled the court is, look, we're not going to be ones who kill Obamacare. If you want to repeal it, go for it, but don't bring us your cases to get rid of it. That didn't stop people from bringing cases. I think our Attorney General has brought up 3 cases since against the ACA, but I think that was a signal from the Chief Justice. We move on now to the final round of ACA, not the final round, at least the one in this book. There's going to be more. We're not done yet. The final round of ACA litigation, which involves the religious nonprofits. Now, Hobby Lobby was the first go-round, right? Hobby Lobby concerned a for-profit corporation that was being forced to pay for this form of contraception. The second go-around involves something called the accommodation. I should put my scare quotes up there. The accommodation was a way of saying, okay, we're not going to make a religious charity pay for the contraception. We are only going to use their plan. And there's a judge in the stream who ruled in such a case, so I will avoid mentioning that one. But the fact of the matter is, the group did not have to pay for it, but they had to basically give information over to the government, and the government could then work through that plan. The lead plaintiff in these cases, the one who got the most notoriety, were the Little Sisters of the Poor. These were a group of nuns who tend to the elderly and the sick. These are amazing people. I went to a lunch after the case was argued. I had lunch with them. It looked like a casting call for The Sound of Music. There were nuns everywhere. How do you solve a problem like Scalia? It's an actual song too. Go download. It's a good tune. But I had too much fun. But the fact of the matter is, this was a group of nuns who did not want to be complicit in the provision of these various products. What makes this case so difficult is ERISA. This case is actually not hinging so much on RFRA as it is on ERISA. And I hate ERISA, but I've had to learn about it. The reason why is depending on how these various plans are structured, the religious burden is actually quite different. And let me explain what I mean by that. There's something called self-insurance. Okay, what is self-insurance? A number of years ago, California enacted a law that said all employers, except for churches, are required to pay for abortions. Yes, did you know that? In California, if you are a Catholic charity, under California law, you're required to cover abortions for your employees. This is true. Now, how do they get around it? Self-insurance. Under self-insurance, state law is preempted through ERISA. Okay? It preempts state law. What does that mean? As, I'll just say, Thomas Aquinas College, which was a college in California, they are their own insurer. They don't hire Aetna or Blue Cross. They are their own insurer. They hire someone to administer their plan, but they operate as their own insurance company. As a result, they preempt the state law through ERISA, and they're not bound by these various mandates. So the government has basically said, if you are self-insured, we can't make you do this, right? We can't force you to do this. Another option is something called a church plan under ERISA. Okay, what's a church plan? As it sounds, if you are a church or affiliated with the church, you're also exempted from ERISA. But there are some kinds of plans which are not church plans, and they're not self-insurance plans, where a group simply hires and contracts with Aetna to run their insurance. This is where the rubber meets the road. Because here, the government isn't actually forcing the employer to pay for this stuff. They're forcing the insurance company to do it. This is where the case gets most difficult. And this is why the Supreme Court this past year, I think, was utterly unable to decide the thing. Even with 8 justices, they could not reach a resolution. Okay? The long and short of it is, at the end of this argument, the court sent an order out. They said, well, we heard your arguments. Do you have any other ideas? Right? Anything else? Right? Any other thoughts of how to make this work? Right? Any other ideas? And then the Solicitor General put a brief in, and Paul Clement put a brief in, and basically saying, well, no, not really, because if we could have worked it out, we would have. There's a big divide between the parties, and the divide is this, my friends. The government wants seamless coverage, right? They want a female employee to use the same card and the same doctor and the same everything to get this coverage. The religious groups say, well, just give them a separate card, right? Or let them go on Obamacare, healthcare.gov, and buy a contraceptive-only plan. This is a chasm between the two parties. The government wants no burden for the women to get extra care. Another judge. There's no undue burden, shall we say, to access these sorts of products. And the challenge say, well, what's the big deal signing up for a second card? They're not going to agree on this. And in fact, these cases are on remand now. I pity the circuit judges who have to deal with this because there's not much guidance from the Supreme Court. It's like, figure this out, do something else. This case will come back up probably in the next year or so, at which point perhaps we'll have 9 justices. I don't know how they're going to resolve this because the ERISA issues make this extremely complicated. And to give you one last bit on the ERISA, the government's argued, well, if there's a problem with self-insurance, why can't we just get the charities to switch to a regular plan, not use self-insurance? Well, the second they give up self-insurance, they are now banned by California's surgical abortion mandate. That is one hell of a burden, right? To make them give up a plan which exempts them under ERISA from a much stricter burden to actually not paying for birth control, right? Paying for straight-up surgical abortions, because that's the law in California. And indeed, the California Supreme Court upheld that law, saying it does not violate the free exercise of a Catholic charity for them to have insurance coverage for abortions. If you want to read a good dissent, Judge Janice Rogers Brown, who was then a justice, has a very strong dissent on this point. It's like a 2003 or 4 case. So where are we now? And then Will kindly teased the next book. At some point, I'll write the trilogy, which I think we call Undone. And I think this is where I want to leave the talk and then shift over to questions and answers. The ACA in its current form is not sustainable. And I'm not simply saying this because I don't like it. The policy is actually largely immaterial to me. The reason why this is not sustainable can be summed up in 2 words from my favorite economist, Hayek: the fatal conceit. People know what I'm talking about. The central planners who created this law, from Jonathan Gruber on down, thought, well, we can make the market work. If we tweak these subsidies and put these regulations in place and put these mandates and put this and that, we can make everything work. It didn't. They vastly overestimated how popular this would be. They vastly underestimated how people would game this system. They also underestimated how the insurance companies would play along. You're seeing now insurers drop out of the marketplace because these are not profitable. They are not making money on this. And when companies aren't making money, they're in trouble. So what's next? About 2 months ago, President Obama wrote in the Journal of the American Medical Association, I'm sure it went through peer review, that we should. It's actually Barack Obama JD. That's how he's listed in the American. It's true. He has a law degree. I mean, it's his title. But he actually proposed that, well, there was this idea that when we were first, debating ACA, called the public option. So what's the public option? Exactly what it sounds like. You have a government plan that competes with the private plan. Okay, Senator Lieberman, who came from Connecticut, a state with lots of insurance companies, said, I will not vote for this for the public option, so that was killed. It actually wasn't Republicans who killed it, it was Joe Lieberman. So put that in your history book. But President Obama said we should now consider a public option as a way to repair the ACA. My friend Seth Chandler, who teaches at the University of Houston, describes the public option as a Trojan horse with windows. There is no mystery about what this will do. The government can and will undercut and underprice the insurers. This will more or less kill the private market for insurance. So unless you're getting it from your employer, you'll be on the government option. And if you want to look at what a government-provided health plan looks like, look at the VA. Right? We have one. We know what it looks like. Go look at the VA. And I think you will get a glimpse of what comes next. I'll close my talk with a preview of what happens regardless of whoever is it Clinton or Trump is elected. Nothing is going to happen. More likely than not, the Republicans will probably keep the House. Okay, that means no bill goes anywhere to repair Obamacare. Republicans, I think, are content to let this thing wither on the vine. Their constituents tend not to be on government insurance, so this is not a big problem for them, although maybe it will become one later. In the unlikely event, though, that you have a Democrat president and both houses are Democratic, and I don't say this lightly, I think the filibuster goes away. I think we actually, not just for judges, we lose a filibuster altogether. Harry Reid's been murmuring about this. And once you get down to 50, you can create a public option very quickly. And I think to the extent that the ACA is amended, it's done without the benefit of a filibuster, and you effectively have a straight 51 vote, whatever it is, provision. At that point, hold your hats, my friends, because the sorts of things that can be passed when there's no filibuster are frankly startling. The Supreme Court, it doesn't matter. That filibuster's gone. The second, if there's a Clinton presidency and a Democratic Senate, they're going to confirm whoever they want with 51 votes. Will be Garland? I don't know. He's a nice guy, I guess, but I don't think he'll get his shot. I'm going to stop here. I did this all without any slides, so I guess it can be done. And I thank you for your attention. I welcome your questions. Thank you so much. Force of habit. I even told this. Force of habit. questions? No questions? Yeah, Mr. Glazer.
Thank you very much for your talk today. I'm curious what your thoughts would be on, in the unlikely scenario that the Republicans hold the House, hold the Senate, win the presidency, and there is some impetus.
What are you on? I'd like some. No,
Yeah.
Sorry. That was a bad question. I'm sorry.
Yeah. But, what do you do to actually unwind this if you do have some of the political actors in place who would be willing and able to do so?
Okay, so it's a very good question. It has as hallucinatory. Are you in the peyote, maybe? I don't know. It's a very good question. This is going to sound harsh, but people have to lose the plans they like. And this is an awful message I wish the president was honest about. The single biggest problem in our healthcare system is you have insurance tied to employment. It's an awful idea that whose fault is it? The unions. I'll tell you why. After World War II, unions began negotiating very strong healthcare plans. Why? Because they were not taxed. So it's a form of non-tax income. So if you're a union employee making maybe $30,000 or $40,000, but you have this platinum-plated insurance plan for your family and everyone else, that's a significant benefit. Even me at whatever that law school over there is called, I pay very little for my insurance. I don't pay much for it, and that's actually an uncompensated benefit. We need to get rid of that. Insurance must be individual, not through employers. But that would require not canceling 4 million plans, but 150 million plans. Until we have that frank conversation, we're in the same cycle, right? You cannot get past this until people are portable with their insurance and not dependent on their employer. Then they can shop, they can compare, and then the market will be much bigger, right? The reason why the ACA markets are so bad now, and in Harris County there are only HMOs, there's no PPOs left on the market, is because not enough people are in them. If we basically get rid of employer-provided health care, you flood the markets. Now, there was one aspect of the ACA meant to do this, the Cadillac tax. The Cadillac tax was a 40% excise tax on insurance. And the idea was, if you have a very generous plan, we're going to penalize the heck out of you and maybe make employers drop it. At South Texas or Houston, wherever I am, right, they told me you're going to lose your plan in a couple of years. But, surprise, surprise, who objects to the Cadillac tax? The unions. So it was already delayed 2 years. It's never going into effect. So the single cost constraint in the ACA meant people to get onto the exchanges is now dead. So until we have this, frankly, brutal conversation that you cannot keep the plan you like, we'll be in the same death spiral. Yes, sir.
Are you advocating essentially we would need to go back to the post-World War II moment of getting something like the NHS or full private?
No, you don't need NHS, right? You don't need an NHS, but you simply make it that people buy their own insurance through a marketplace, not through their employers. And that makes enough people in the marketplaces so that they're solvent. We do not need, oh God, please don't understand me. We do not need a national healthcare system. If I do that, I'll have to quit writing books and go somewhere else. Yeah, Mr. Peters.
Let's talk about the littering on the vine.
Oh, I love that expression. Everyone knows the context. That's Newt Gingrich, right? Was that Newt? Talking about Medicaid or something?
No, I was actually just talking about assuming a Republican and a Democratic president. What happens next? You said we're unsustainable right now. Is there something that could be done by executive order to at least keep the Affordable Care Act from moving along? Or is it necessarily going to collapse in the next 4 years or so without legislative changes? And how does that collapse happen?
Okay, so the collapse will not be totally noticeable at once. In metropolises like Harris County, there will always be plans. But if you're in a small county in Arizona or Arkansas, you may have only one provider on the exchanges, right? Usually it's going to be a Blue Cross Blue Shield because they have lots of money. So you're going to have lots of places where people only have one plan to buy. So it won't be entirely clear that there's even a collapse. But what will happen is fewer and fewer people will buy it, right? If it's too expensive, they're simply not going to buy it. And you're actually going to see already the insurance rate plateauing, right? The government expected that by 2016 there'd be roughly 20 million people in the exchanges. How many are there? Like 11. They're not even halfway to their goal. So if that number keeps plateauing, it's not going to implode at once, but you will simply not see people signing up. Now, Will's question was also good. What kind of executive action could the next president take? They're already doing it. One of the few things that Marco Rubio did that was actually solid recently was to vote to defund what are called the risk corridors. Right? These were basically bailouts to transfer money from taxpayers to insurance companies. Those were defunded. They're doing it anyway. And I don't want to bore you with the details, but there's actually money that's supposed to be deposited in the U.S. Treasury, and they're taking it out and giving it to the insurance companies. It is utterly and completely illegal. Completely illegal. It says, first you put in the Treasury, whatever's left over, give to the insurance companies. They're dipping into the U.S. Treasury. You want to talk about Anti-Deficiency Act? One of the few saving graces of a Trump presidency would be prosecuting all these people for illegal payments. I'd be signing up to do that. But there's a lot of illegal stuff going on. They shut down the bridges and everything else, but we'll figure it out.
In the sort of unlikely event that we sweep in November, right? From a legal standpoint, how do you get rid of employer-provided healthcare? Because even if you have the hard conversation, it seems to me like there's a tougher sell. Namely, like you have to eliminate an entire market.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
yeah.
Do you penalize employers for providing it? Like, how it's sort of on a mechanics level.
That was what the Cadillac tax was designed to do. It was a 40% tax on insurance plans. Employers are already saying, "Wow, we're never going to pay this. We'll just drop people." That's how you do it. You tell people we will tax the hell of your plans. You also make the individual pay income tax on the benefits from insurance. You may not have noticed this, but on your W-2 at the end of the year, it now says how much benefits you got from health insurance. Have you noticed that recently? Yeah, that's a change from the ACA. One day there will be a line saying that's now taxed at 35%. So the way to get people off is to make this no longer a benefit. And really, it's an awful idea. Why are we giving people tax-free health insurance? Let them invest it, right? I mean, I guess you have health savings accounts, but this is a terrible way of spending money. But again, Alexandra's point's right. It's a harsh conversation. You have to piss off a lot of people, and I don't think any politician has the courage to do this at all. Judge?
Isn't it more likely, given the catastrophic collapse of the system you're talking about, that instead of a vast marketplace of individuals trying to find their own health care, given our society's slow, steady drift away from the constitutional republic toward Plato's republic, that we're more likely to have a government-mandated single-payer health care?
Yeah, we're delaying the inevitable. I think the judge is on point. To use another phrase from Hayek, the road to serfdom, we're on it, and we're tiptoeing along. I don't say it's to be a nihilist or a pessimist, but we now have roughly half of Americans on government subsidized health insurance. This is like Mitt Romney's 47% comment, right? When you have so many people on government subsidized health insurance, you can't take that away from people. You cannot remove an entitlement. It doesn't work. So the other question you should get is, did the architects of Obamacare intend for this to fail? People nodding their heads. Did they intend for this to collapse? I'll give a qualified not so fast. Okay, they probably realized this wasn't a permanent solution, but even in their infinite hubris, they didn't realize it would collapse in less than 3 years. Right? They thought, okay, we'll get 10 years out, and then people are going to like it, and then we'll have some sort of movement for single payer. It happened quick. So this public option is but a mere Trojan horse to get to single payer. You're going to have, once a public option is in place, employers start dropping people, and not like lawyers, but people working minimum wage jobs and people working hourly, and they'll say, okay, go on healthcare.gov. We're not going to keep you on board. I always ask how many years we got. I don't know, maybe 10, 20 years, but start saving. Judge.
Could you just comment on the effect, if any, of this whole analysis of two things that exist now, which is one, the inability to sell insurance across state lines, and number two, the availability of pre-existing coverage?
Thank you. So the first point, and this is the favorite Republican talk about, why don't we sell insurance across state lines? It actually doesn't make a lot of sense because networks are based on local doctors, right? If I buy a plan in Houston, I'm going to get, MD Anderson, Texas Children, right? It doesn't make sense to negotiate plans that have many networks. It's too expensive. You want to negotiate for the places where you live. So I think this is mostly a red herring the Republicans like to repeat. This was Donald Trump's the lines, right? To get rid of the lines around the states. There's not much there. But the second point that the judge raised, I think, is actually very good. The most popular part of the ACA is to saying we cannot charge more to people with pre-existing conditions. In fact, if I remember the numbers correctly, 80% of people said we'd like this provision. Okay, but when they ask a slightly different question, what if that provision makes your healthcare more expensive? That number dropped down. The reason why healthcare has become more expensive is we are treating people who have these various pre-existing conditions. There are ways of accomplishing this without the sort of regime we have. For example, if you have a pre-existing condition, you can buy insurance, but you have to stay insured. If you voluntarily drop your coverage, you lose out. This would go a long way reducing costs, because what happens? A lot of people now who are sick sign up, get chemotherapy, and then drop their coverage. And they leave Aetna with a $500,000 bill they're never going to pay. This is not sustainable. the empathy, to use the word of the day, right? The empathy for these people with conditions needs to be tempered with the fact that it's very expensive to treat them. It makes all of our coverage more expensive, and this is, again, the brutally honest conversation, that to cover these people, we're going to have to pay for it. I would actually, to be frank, I would actually favor a tax on health insurance to cover these sick people rather than making it subsidized through the marketplace. Put a straight-up tax, make it obvious, and then they can have a special risk pool for these sorts of individuals. Yes, ma'am?
Turning to the religious liberty aspects of this, say, we have the Hobby Lobby victory for religious liberty, say when Ziegler comes back up, that ends up prevailing for Little Sisters of the Poor. What do you think the collateral damage of this litigation is going to be in the long term on religious liberty, in that you see how controversial RFRA has become in the past 20 years and how hard it is to get any sort of exemption through the legislature at this point, that you're not going to see any debate on the fallout of religious liberty, just turning this more and more over to the administrative aspect. And in a Republican administration, you might get protections out of administration and interpretation, but in a Democratic one, you're up a creek and under Chevron.
Yeah. So I'm sorry Marcella isn't here. She's actually one of my favorite religious liberty people to talk to us about. But I don't think RFRA is along for this world. If you look what happened in Indiana and North Carolina, states that attempt to pass laws that protect religious liberty are simply tarred as bigotry. It's not accurate, but the narrative is stuck. And now you're having, the NCAA boycott North Carolina. You go to China and Cuba, whatever, but they'll boycott North Carolina. I think you're going to start seeing states repeal the RFRAs, Connecticut and others. Most states don't have them. And I think we will actually see at one point an establishment clause challenge to RFRA. I don't think they're long for this world. And I think we'll be back in Justice Scalia's Smith realm, where if it's a law of general applicability, it's fine. So you're going to need actually legislatures to pass various laws unless courts strike those down too. Yeah.
Well, I happened to read the Wall Street Journal. There's a recent article that shows that the U.S. Civil Rights Commission has said that civil rights trump religious liberties.
Well, he said more. His name was Castro, oddly enough. The chairman of the government was Castro, and he basically said religious liberty is code for bias and bigotry.
Yes, right.
That thing is almost a paraphrase. So yeah, I don't think these laws are long for the world. I think
that could affect a law license.
Oh God! So I got to talk about this.
Some guy comes to me.
So yeah,
and I have a religious.
So I got to talk about this. So everyone follow the ABA's new rule. Was 8.4G. I might get the letter wrong, but it's 8.4G. And the law basically says that in your practice, you cannot manifest bias based on sexual orientation, socioeconomic class, a host of others. That is a radical change that the ABA model rules adopted. And I give an example from my own. I'm writing a paper on this, but from my own perspective, if I teach a case, let's call it US v. Texas, keep it local, and I say that this policy is unconstitutional and that these people should be subject to removal, and I have a student, let's say, who says you're manifesting bias based on ethnicity against immigrants. It's happened. Okay, I can lose my law license. I'm engaging in something related to the practice of law, teaching these young skulls of mush how to be attorneys. It's a required class to pass the bar, and I just manifested bias on the basis of ethnicity.
But you could get the safe harbor by advocating your bias in support of an underrepresented or underserved group.
Well, actually, it's good that you mentioned that, because this is actually not a joke. In the commentary to that rule, it specifically says if you are taking actions in favor of inclusion, you're exempt. There's actually a commentary excluding it, saying if you're trying to promote diversity, you can consider these sorts of actions. I'm not making it up. I have a paper about this. I'm trying to raise hell, but this is a serious thing. And if you're on your state bar committees, fight this rule. This is bad. This is not a good rule. Yes, sir.
You described that about 50% of Americans receive government subsidies for their health care. Does that figure include all those persons who receive the $250 billion tax exemption that corporations receive for providing health care?
I didn't even count that in. I'm talking about direct subsidies. But yeah, I mean, government is so enmeshed in our healthcare system, to go back to the judge's question, I don't see any way around this. And I'll keep writing about it, and maybe one day there'll be history saying, oh, Blackmun sounded the alarm. But this is going to happen. I just don't know when. Will's giving me the cutoff mark.
I suspect more or less.
Yeah.
Thank you for answering questions, Josh. We appreciate your time. One point of personal privilege. You talked about employment division versus Smith. course, Justice Scalia wrote the majority that said that there is no religious exception to neutral laws compelled by the Free Exercise Clause. Do you recall who wrote the dissent?
Yeah, it was Brennan. O'Connor.
Blackmun, I think.
Blackmun,
yeah. That dissent was joined, of course, by the well-known opponent of civil rights, Justice Thurgood Marshall.
Yeah.
Right. He was the one arguing in favor of greater protection of religious liberty about 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And it's amazing how much things have changed since then. Well, Josh, we really appreciate you joining us today.
Appreciate it. Thank you all so much. And if you have questions, I'll come up. And if anyone wants an autographed bookplate, I'd be happy to sign it for you. Thank you so much.